you think he should be punished? Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence. But no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death, but not for her murder. I would understand a penalty for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
Westminster police hoping you can help find this missing 19-year-old. She's Leah Charlie Porter. She lives in Pueblo, but she was in Westminster last Thursday when she went missing. Now take a look. Porter's hair is dyed blonde, but she has brown hair. She also has a tattoo on her wrist and her lower lip is pierced. You can call Crime Stoppers or Westminster if you have any information to help find her.
How many years did you know him total?
He was only an acquaintance to me, just someone I knew at school, you know. I didn't really, he was creepy to me. I heard that he had thoughts of raping and killing a certain girl while he was in high school.
You described Chris as being creepy in high school and weird. Can you describe, the creepiness?
He looked frustrated with himself all the time. He would get frustrated with girls because in his head they would be flirting with him. And I talked to everybody I went to school with, not once. Nobody flirted with him. Not one person.
Knowing that Christopher Wade had some very dark and particularly sadistic urges and fantasies as young as teenage life in high school would be reason for any parent to be concerned. And Max Porter, because he went to school with Wade and was aware of these rumors, he's understandably really worried about his sister.
She said she was tired and she just wanted to crash, so I said okay. And I found some of her drugs and confronted her about it that night. Then shortly afterwards, she took off. And I didn't really think much of it. I thought she was just angry at me because I was playing the part of a concerned friend. Overall, she seemed pretty depressed, and while she was smiling, it didn't really go to her eyes. So that kind of was weirding me out to see her like that.
Wade presents here as somebody who's really nervous. His answers almost seemed like they were written for him. Like he's thought about what he was going to say and he's going by his script. Very stilted, very uncomfortable. And he drops comments here and there, almost comments like he thinks he should say. Like he was concerned about her drug addiction. He found drugs. She seemed depressed. But there's really not a lot of emotion behind what he's saying. It's almost to me like he's more concerned about saying the right thing during this interview than he is about not knowing where his friend is.
What are your concerns right now as a friend?
Well, overall, I just want her to be safe. I don't really have very many friends, but the friends I do have, I'm very loyal to. So even losing one is a heavy blow for me.
Refers to having already lost a friend. This has been also seen in other cases where people make a slip. It does raise their suspicion. Some people would say that's due to what we call the guilty knowledge in our head. And that influences the way we think and the way we speak. And he probably didn't intend to say it that way, but you can probably believe it's true. He's already lost that friend.
You seem really shaken right now.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating because I'm more of the person to listen and not speak. So with everyone trying to get in touch with me and ask me what happened, it's kind of, it's been a real sort of shock to my system. Overall, I'm not really handling the situation very well. So far, I was told that I'm not a suspect, but I just want to be as cooperative as possible to make sure that, I stay that way.
He's expressing a concern that the reason he's cooperating with police is because they're telling him he's not a suspect, and he wants to make sure he continues to control that narrative and ensure that he stays off their radar. But what Wade's engaging in is constant impression management. The problem is he doesn't think quickly on his feet, and when it's not rehearsed, you see these awkward behaviors and these cognitive leaks come out in the media interview.
We want to just talk to everybody that, has ever possibly known her, had any relationship with her. Can you fill me up in a little bit of Christopher's history growing up? How did he do in high school?
He kind of struggled in high school. He not really withdrawn. He's a different thinker. Growing up, his dad was into pornography. And Chris found it online at a very young age. Chris was pretty messed up with it in high school.
Okay.
I found he stashed pictures of every sort. It made me sick. I heard things from, the principal called me one day and said he had touched a girl inappropriate at school.
What we now understand about pornography addiction and the influence of pornography exposure on young children as their brains are developing and their sexual identity is developing is that it sets up an expectation around sexuality, intimacy, and interacting with sexual partners that's highly unrealistic. And what also seems quite clear is that there were early warning signs, and his family chose to minimize the seriousness of those.
Now, what about, does he confide in you with any specific fantasies that you would be concerning?
I have to tell you.
I would really appreciate it.
He said that he went out one night, and we didn't know it. And he went to some girl's trailer.
Yeah.
We live out in the mountains. And so he walked over there and went in with the intention of kidnapping her and taking her out in the woods.
Do you think he actually did that?
I don't know. I didn't think so, but he told me that he did a couple of times. He told me that he went to her trailer in the middle of the night and that he was going to kidnap her, but the dog started barking or something, and so he got scared and left.
Here we have Wade's own mother confirming the rumors and the other perceptions that Leah's family has about him. When you think about these red flags of not only express sexual fantasies, violent, deviant fantasies, but also actual behavior where he enacted some of those fantasies. When you take that with what we have in this current situation where he's being investigated for a missing woman, it certainly is very concerning when you think about all the history that we have thus far.
But since he's gotten out of high school, he's gotten himself on a really good track, and he went into the Army. He did some deployment time. He started having nightmares in deployment, and they sent him back.
For psychiatric reasons?
Yes.
You know, was he diagnosed with anything?
No.
The psychological evaluation from the United States Army that was done in preparation for Wade's discharge paints a very different picture than what his mother wants to believe or what he maybe told her. Wade was quite forthcoming with the doctor that he has ongoing urges and fantasies of raping a specific classmate. And what the doctor ultimately says, which is both alarming and quite astute, is that while there's no evidence that Wade has harmed anybody, he's dangerous, he has the potential for dangerousness.
What's your gut feeling? You're his mom.
About Leah is I totally believe that he has not done anything.
I want you to understand that you're not in custody, that you know we're focusing in on you to make an arrest or something like that. That's not the case.
Okay. I know that much.
You understand that?
Yeah, I'm studying criminal justice. So I kind of know how these things sort of work.
Okay.
Learning about a lot of this stuff in class.
In this particular scene where he's being interviewed by the police and they're going, oh, I do, criminal justice. So a way of saying, I'm kind of like you. Like, we have something in common. It's his effort to control the image of him in the police's eyes, to make him look like he's cooperative, he's on board, he's a good person. It's part of his image of being the helpful friend.
When you talked to our officers on the 5th, which was, you think, last Thursday, what did the cops tell you?
They got my statement. They were asking me, what happened. And there wasn't anything new, so they were just calling me to try and get it straight from the horse's mouth of the facts. I know I talked to Lee's mom, Renee, as well as her brother, Max. He was, I think he was skeptical because he thought I had done something, but...
Why do you say that?
Just in his mannerisms, it seemed like he was under the impression that I was since I was the last person to see her, that I therefore must be the person that did something to her. I told him that I did a tarot reading for her, but I didn't learn anything of where she might be from it, so I didn't think it was important.
You did a tarot reading while she was with you?
Yes.
Or before she left? Or after she left?
While she was with me. I treated her out to lunch. I was being as courteous as possible to her. But throughout the whole time, the smiles never went to her eyes. Amy. Well, normal smiling will cause the eyes to start to crinkle a little bit, to squint. But when she was smiling, it was just with her mouth. There wasn't any eye movement. That tells me that she was telling the truth when she was depressed. But now that I think about it, this might have been that she didn't like lying to me.
Here, Wade is almost presenting himself like he's an expert in behavioral analysis and almost teaching the investigators about what a real smile looks like and how he's able to discern when she's telling him the truth or not. He wants them to believe that he knows more than he really does and that he's a different person than he really is. He's lying and manipulating.
And then afterwards, she just asked, I'm tired, can I just pass out for a while? And then about I don't know, an hour, hour and a half after. That was when my roommate came back home. Well, for the most part, she was asleep in my bed. And I started thinking, and she had that bag with her that she didn't let leave her side.
And in fact, you later looked in that bag.
Yes.
Or what did you see?
Afterwards, I saw her drug paraphernalia. I woke her up very gently. Yeah, I apologized to her because I had looked into the bag.
What was her response to you violating her privacy?
I think she understood where I was coming from because, as I told her, I was worried about her. And not because I have any sort of physical or emotional attraction to her. I wouldn't mind if something like that developed in the future. And I made sure that she understood that I was not angry with her for doing it or using, but that I was disappointed that she didn't come forward with that to me. I mean, she was annoyed, yes, but not irritated.
We see this parent-child judgmental quality in Wade's attitude time and time again. What we also need to pay attention to is that, consistent with what we see with psychopathic offenders oftentimes, is this shallow affect. There's this shallowness to his emotions. They're superficial. He's using all these flowery words as if he's rereading a script that he's worked out in his head that is gentle and soft and almost romantic in nature. And yet, the words and content he's describing is an ugly confrontation about drug paraphernalia. And the two just don't add up.
Well, Chris, I'm going to ask you flat out right now. Do you know where Leah is? Did you do something?
I did nothing to her beyond what I've already said. And honestly, I have no idea where she is. A lot of things that could have happened. To me, the most logical things are that she took the advice from my tarot reading beyond the level that I intended. Or that she is just has fallen back into using drugs, and that she is ashamed to talk to people right now.
Explain to me how you ended up doing a tarot reading for her.
After I laid out the cards, the first thing that popped out to me were that there were 3 of the major arcana. Those indicate something significant. I explained the combination for the Ace of Wands and the High Priestess. The 3 of Cups is representative of something to be celebrated. So overall, there was nothing to me, as far as the tarot card reading, to indicate any sort of physical harm to her.
Okay. What else did you tell her that the cards showed?
Overall, I told her that this was was one of the more optimistic readings that I had ever done.
But are you encouraging her to start a new life?
I encouraged her more off of the death side to, trim the tree and, take a close look at her life and to trim off what was being a bad influence.
So the part that makes no sense is he's just said to the police, maybe she took the intent of my reading too far. But when he's explaining the reading, it's supposed to be a joyous, celebratory thing. There's nothing malevolent in the reading that says, like, die, hurt yourself, bad things coming up. She's off celebrating, or she's in a good space, which is really incongruous. Why would you be worried? So the police have a right to be suspicious of it.
Once she got in that truck and left your parking lot, you had not
That was
seen
the
her
last
since.
I have seen her.
So is there any reason why we would find Lee's blood in your apartment? Or in your car?
Well, when we were starting to get a little more physical, we accidentally bumped into each other. We had a nosebleed. I didn't really think much of it at the time, so after she got up, I cleaned up a little bit of a mess. I mean, it wasn't a major gusher, it was just a couple of drops.
We see Wade stumble here. He didn't expect law enforcement to kind of confront him about some of the blood evidence, to confront him and push him, and because he hadn't thought about that, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. He didn't have an explanation, but it is also important to note the ease with which he just makes something up, and that kind of pathological, compulsive ability to lie and just fill in the blanks is something we consistently see time and time again in psychopathic offenders.
So where are your sheets and your pillow?
My pillows are currently on my bed. As far as the sheets, I have no clue. Checking stuff in the laundry pile isn't something you really remember all that much, so it was routine.
You didn't get rid of the sheets?
No.
It seems inconsistent to us based on the condition of your apartment that you would be all of a sudden in the middle of a sexual experience taking your sheets and taking them off the bed.
Let's face it, your apartment's not exactly the tidiest. Okay.
I'd be the first to admit that.
It just doesn't make sense.
Honestly, when you put it that way, it doesn't really make much sense to me either. Two words that would describe me almost perfectly would be unorthodox and weird. And I'll straight up admit it that I'm probably one of the weirdest guys most people would probably know.
The only thing we ask is to tell us the truth. What's the deal with the sheets?
Alright, yeah, I did get rid of it.
Her cell phone ended up at the same place the sheets did at the dump.
I do not know. Honestly, I saw her leave with her cell phone.
How do you know she left with the cell phone?
This is the time for you to be honest with her.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the right words because I know that I have been untruthful. I'll straight up admit it, it bugs me to hell that I have been. But yes, her phone was with the sheets.
They're throwing out information that they don't yet really have, like her cell phone was found, right, with her clothing. And you hear Wade sigh. He's got to come up with a new story. And he goes, no, I saw her leave with her cell phone. But then you hear him sigh again. He's working really hard at trying to figure out. So when he then finally says, I'm searching for the right words, I believe him. He's trying to figure out what is the best way I can frame this.
Is she lying in the dump somewhere?
God, no. That's something I've had nightmares about. Hearing that she's been found somewhere in a dump someplace. I really do not want that for her.
So where is she?
Honestly, I do not know. She left and got into the truck.
Of course, this is a place where you need to tell us what happened to Lee.
Am I being accused of something?
What do you think?
It sounds to me like yes. And I maintain my innocence, but I would like a lawyer.
911.
Yes, I'd like to confess to a murder.
Okay. What happened?
The case is into the disappearance of Lee Porter.
Ma'am? What? Can you take a deep breath? What's your name? My baby, my little baby. What are you calling about? That guy just admitted he killed my daughter.
The last couple of days, we've been playing buddy-buddy with him over text, trying to make him think that we didn't think he did it. We got him to meet up with us to do a tarot card reading for my sister. And then I told him, I was like, I know you know where my sister is. And then he looked in my eyes and he said, I know. Chris.
I know.
Look at me right in my eyes. Dude, where is she?
Okay, look, and you have every right to be angry with me for lying to you. And I will be going forward with the police about this. I haven't yet because I'm trying to find the right way to do it.
This is the right way, right?
Yeah, I know. But what I say right now, it's going to be very hard. But until I come forward with them to it, it'll be within the week, I swear to you. But I'm gonna have to ask you to keep it to yourselves until then.
A great moment where you get a peek sort of into thinking of a psychopath who is self-absorbed. And he keeps saying, I know this is gonna be hard for you to hear. It's not really empathetic. His expectation is they should accept it on his terms. But that's the manifestation of control that you do see with psychopaths. They want to be in charge of the information and in control of other people's feelings about it.
Tell me right now what happened to my sister. You know what happened to my sister.
She wasn't yelling, but she was very venomous. And she grabbed the knife that I keep by my bed. And when we go back, I can show it to you. She grabbed it and pulled it out and tried to attack me.
She wouldn't do that, dude. She wouldn't do that, Chris. Stop lying. She wouldn't.
Then after I was coherent enough to start functioning again, I'll admit it, I wasn't rational, and I did things that I should not have with what happened next. And I swear I didn't tie her up. I put the 2 trash bags underneath because after I got rid of her, I didn't want the smell to attract anyone. And they were those odor control trash bags. I put a bag over her head, and then I placed 2 on top of her. I know you won't believe me, but I will be turning myself in to the police. I will tell them.
No, you're going to jail right now. You're going to prison right now. Call the cops.
What were the verbal threats she made to you?
She kept on saying, I need the drugs, you have to get them for me. And if you don't, then I'm going to cut you.
But she actually used the words, I'm going to cut you?
Yes. I'm sure she intended to, based off of the acidity in her voice, I'm sure she intended on very deep wounds.
At what point did she grab the stuff?
It was shortly after she had threatened to come here to the police station to report that I had raped her.
He's now tossed in the word rape, and he's now woven it into the story to make him the victim, that he was going to be accused of rape, and that he was defending himself. But he, in the story, is the victim. It's consistent with how he's tried to represent himself all the way along.
She grabbed the knife, and she started thrusting it at me. It was overhand, straightforward. I dodged the first one, and the second time I grabbed her hand and spun her around so that her body was between the knife and myself. And I placed my hand right at her throat. And then after a while, it was just like a rubber band snap. Her muscles went lax all of a sudden, and I wasn't expecting it, so I jerked it and it cut her along her sternum.
And now see, when you first started telling us this, you didn't mention anything about her saying that she was going to come here and report that you raped her.
I'm sorry for that. I thought I had told that to you when I was initially describing what had happened. So that was my mistake, and I apologize for that.
Even at this point in the investigation, when he is clearly at the end of his rope, he's still not able to say, I murdered her, I'm responsible for her death. He just says, I played a major role in it. And that lack of responsibility taking is something that we see time and time again in psychopathic individuals. It's everybody else's fault but theirs, or it's a misunderstanding.
Did you have sex with her after she was dead?
No. Ew. That's not even in anything of my fantasies even. My fantasies from high school had gone pretty dark, and that wasn't even in there.
So you say that's not part of your fantasies. What are your fantasies?
I would rather not answer that. But suffice to say that they were not that dark.
What we know from the investigation is that we have a person who engaged in quite a bit of deviant sexual fantasies, urges, and to some degree, behaviors. No less than 21,000 images found on his computers and various hard drives that would be identified as possible child pornography. You start to look at all these things that are found in Wade's history. We realize this is somebody who has escalating deviant urges that are sadistic in nature. And when you couple that with the impulse control issues, this is a very dangerous individual.
Do you think what you did was wrong?
I'm not going to judge it right or wrong, but I do regret what I did, and I keep wishing that I could go back and do it over again to try and keep that from happening.
Do you think you should be punished?
Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence, but no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
What caused her death?
Me. By choking her.
Okay, did you talk to our police dispatcher?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would it surprise you that exactly what you said is, I would like to confess to a murder? That's exactly what you said, because I heard the recording.
If it's on the recording, then I must have.
Okay, but that's what you did?
I did not murder her.
Again, we see the I know better. Let me discuss the semantics of her death versus murder. There is such a heightened level of grandiosity that's on display here, and also a failure to accept responsibility. So we know that individuals with psychopathy often will find other reasons to justify their behavior. So maybe in his mind, murder is just coldly killing someone without any provocation, and he's still somehow trying to hang on to this idea that he was just defending himself against her.
I just want to give you the opportunity to add whatever you want to.
It's just that overall, I live my life as not really emotionless as possible, but not very touchy-feely either. It's not that I don't feel emotion, but I keep a very tight rein on it. And at my grandmother's funeral, I probably cried maybe 4 or 5 tears total. But I keep a tight chain on it. Because about the only emotion that I find any sort of value in is loyalty to friends, to family, stuff like that.
It's interesting and really speaks to a lack of self-awareness that he talks about the thing he values most and the emotion he values most is loyalty. He talks about to friends, and we know from the investigation he really doesn't have any. So what I think he's really talking about is loyalty to himself. He's betrayed himself. He's told on himself. He didn't handle this the way he thought he would. And any suggestions of regret really seem to be more about the fact that he's gotten caught.
Developing right now, the search tonight for the body of Lee Porter. Her high school friend is sitting behind bars linked to her murder. Christopher Wade turned himself in to Westminster Police last night. Now the suspect is in jail on charges of sexual assault and murder. Police searched his apartment twice and today sectioned off part of a public landfill in connection with the case.
Is there anything that you would like to request right now from us before we go through the process?
I have no other requests to make other than you keep in mind my decision not to lead an overly emotional life.
So in 2022, almost 8 years sort of after being in prison, Christopher Wade decides to write a letter describing the events of what took place on that day when he killed Leah. And it's not sent to anyone in specific, it's just sent to the court. In the letter, he goes into quite a bit of detail about the events that occurred that day that I think are in many ways illustrative of what goes on in the mind of a psychopath in terms of the use of other people. What Wade writes in the letter is that when Leah was there, she went into the bathroom. There was never any episode of doing a tarot reading for her. There was never an episode of her wanting drugs and trying to hold him hostage with a knife. She went into the bathroom, and then he describes that there's a moment when she came out of the bathroom where something just snapped, and he was filled with aggression, rage, and sexual desire for her, and he immediately attacked her, restrained her, and choked her. I think there's more truth in here about what he did to her, and the reason I believe that is it's more consistent with what we know about his fantasy life and what he was interested in, but I don't believe that he's told us the entire story.
On the morning of June 17, 1933, Kansas City was beginning another day beneath the shadow of the Great Depression. At Union Station, trains arrived and departed. Passengers moved through the great terminal, and the ordinary machinery of travel continued as it had countless times before. But somewhere inside that routine was a prisoner whose journey had already become the center of a dangerous criminal operation. His name was Frank "Jelly" Nash. He was a professional criminal, a fugitive who had escaped from federal custody and remained beyond the reach of the law for years. Now he was finally in handcuffs, surrounded by law enforcement officers, and being taken back toward the prison from which he had once escaped. What happened next would take less than a minute, but in those few seconds, for law enforcement officers and Nash himself would be dead. The men responsible had not come to kill Nash. They had come to save him. That contradiction sits at the heart of the Kansas City massacre. The operation had been conceived as a rescue. Instead, it became a fatal ambush, leaving 5 people dead and transforming a prisoner transfer into one of the most notorious gun battles of the gangster era. At the center of the scene was Frank Nash. He had been captured only the day before, June 16, 1933, in Hot Springs, Arkansas. His capture was the result of a long pursuit. Nash had escaped from the U.S. penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, on October 19, 1930. The escape had made him a wanted man, and the investigation surrounding him had eventually stretched far beyond Kansas. The FBI had pursued leads as far as Canada, while investigators continued to examine Nash's connections to other professional criminals. By 1933, his name was already familiar to law enforcement. His return to federal custody was therefore not a minor prisoner transfer. It was the end of a search that had lasted years. 2 FBI agents, Frank Smith and F. Joseph Lackey, working with McAllister, Oklahoma. Police Chief Otto Reed had finally captured Nash in Hot Springs. From there, he was taken to Fort Smith and placed on a Missouri Pacific train bound toward Kansas and the prison at Leavenworth. The schedule was known. The train was expected to reach Kansas City's Union Station at approximately 7:15 in the morning on June 17th. That information would prove deadly. Somewhere in Kansas City, people connected to Nash's criminal world were already thinking about how to get him back. Vern Miller was the central figure in that effort. Miller was not simply another criminal associate. He had a background that made him particularly dangerous. He had served during World War I and had received training with machine guns. After returning to South Dakota, he had even served as a police officer and sheriff before turning toward criminal activity. His later career brought him into the criminal underworld of St. Paul and Chicago. The FBI also regarded him as a hired gun associated with Louis Buckleter. When word reached Kansas City that Nash had been captured, a group consisting of Richard Galatas, Herbert Farmer, Louis "Doc" Stachey, and Frank Malloy began organizing a rescue. Miller became the man responsible for finding the people and resources necessary to carry it out. At Frank Malloy's bar in Kansas City, Miller made repeated telephone calls looking for assistance. 2 names eventually became part of the plan: Charles "Pretty Boy" Floyd and Adam Ricchetti. Floyd was already known as a bank robber. Ricchetti, younger than Floyd, also had a criminal history involving robbery and banks. Their journey to Kansas City would itself become part of the chain of events leading to the massacre. Their vehicle broke down in Bolivar, Missouri. While they waited at a garage, Sheriff Jack Killingsworth entered. Ricchetti recognized him. According to the supplied FBI account, Ricchetti pointed a machine gun at the sheriff while Floyd drew 2.45 pistols and took control of the situation. The two men obtained another vehicle, forced Killingsworth to accompany them temporarily, and later released him. By approximately 10 p.m. on June 16th, Floyd and Ricchetti had reached Kansas City. They met Vernon Miller. By then, the crucial information was already available. Frank Nash would arrive at Union Station the following morning. The plan was ready, while the three men prepared for the rescue. The law enforcement officers responsible for Nash had no reason to expect that the prisoner transfer would become a battlefield. On the morning of June 17th, Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti drove a Chevrolet sedan to Union Station. Meanwhile, Nash arrived with the officers accompanying him. Among them were FBI Special Agents Frank Smith, F., Joseph Lackey, and Raymond J. Caffrey. FBI Special Agent in charge Reed Vetterli, Police Chief Otto Reed, and Kansas City officers Frank Hermanson and William Grooms. Nash was handcuffed. The Chevrolet intended to transport him was positioned near the east entrance of the station. The scene may have looked like the final routine stage of a prisoner transfer, but the men waiting nearby had already made their decision. Caffrey opened the vehicle. Nash was directed inside. Lackey moved into the rear, with Smith beside him. Chief Reed was positioned toward the rear right. Caffrey moved around toward the driver's position. Vetterli, Hermanson, and Grooms were near the front of the vehicle. Then Lackey saw something that changed the entire scene. Two men were moving toward them from behind another vehicle. They were armed. At least one carried a machine gun. There was almost no time to react. Before the officers could fully understand what was happening, a warning was shouted. Up, up! Then came another command. Let him have it. The gunfire began. What followed lasted approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds is almost impossible to comprehend as the length of a massacre. It is shorter than the time required to explain what is happening. It is shorter than a normal conversation. Yet within those few moments, the lives of 5 people were destroyed. Frank Hermanson was shot and killed. William Grooms was also shot and killed. Reed Vetterli was wounded in the arm. Raymond J. Caffrey was shot as he was preparing to take the driver's position. Inside the vehicle, Frank Nash was struck by gunfire. Chief Otto Reed was also hit. Nash died at the scene. Chief Reed died as well. F. Joseph Lackey was struck 3 times, but survived. Frank Smith survived the attack. Caffrey, however, was critically wounded. He was taken toward the hospital but died upon arrival. When the gunfire finally stopped, the rescue operation had become something entirely different. 4 law enforcement officers were dead: FBI Special Agent Raymond J. Caffrey, Kansas City Officer Frank Hermanson, Kansas City Officer William Grooms, and Police Chief Otto Reed of McAlester, Oklahoma. Frank Nash was also dead. The central figure in the rescue plan had become one of its victims. The attackers fled toward their waiting vehicle. One statement heard at the scene was, "They're all dead. Let's get out of here." A Kansas City officer fired toward the fleeing men. One of the gunmen, later identified as Pretty Boy Floyd, was believed to have been struck or shot at, but the attackers escaped. In the immediate confusion, witnesses were not even certain whether there had been 3 or 4 gunmen. The scene at Union Station had lasted only moments, but the consequences would continue for years. For the FBI, the massacre would become a major investigation. For the families of the dead officers, June 17th would become a date permanently associated with loss. And for the criminal world, the operation demonstrated how quickly a carefully planned rescue could turn into catastrophe. Frank Nash had been captured after years as a fugitive. His associates had tried to take him back. Instead, he died beside the very officers who had been charged with returning him to prison. The question that remained was simple, but its answer would lead investigators through a maze of fugitives, criminal connections, physical evidence, and conflicting accounts: who had planned the attack, who had carried it out, And how had a rescue mission become a massacre? The answer would begin with the man who had gathered the pieces together, Vernon Miller. The man at the center of the storm, Frank Nash, was already a fugitive long before the morning of June 17, 1933. By the time his name became permanently connected with the Kansas City massacre, he had spent years moving through the criminal world, escaping custody, and remaining beyond the reach of the authorities who wanted him back in prison. His story did not begin at Union Station. The events there were the final consequence of a much longer history, one that had made Nash valuable to other criminals and important enough for law enforcement to pursue him across state lines. Nash was a professional criminal with a lengthy record. At one point, he had been sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Later, he continued to be involved in robberies and other criminal activity. Eventually, he was imprisoned at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Leavenworth was supposed to be the place where Nash's freedom ended. Instead, on October 19, 1930, he escaped. That escape changed the scale of the search for him. Nash was no longer simply an inmate serving a sentence. He had become a fugitive whose whereabouts were uncertain, whose criminal associations extended beyond one location, and whose ability to remain outside custody demonstrated how difficult it could be for authorities to bring experienced criminals back under control. The FBI began a broad investigation into his whereabouts. The search extended beyond the immediate region and even reached Canada. Investigators were not simply looking for a man who had disappeared from prison. They were also trying to understand the network surrounding him. Nash had connections with other bank robbers and professional criminals, and those relationships helped explain how a fugitive could remain hidden for such a long period. His criminal associations also became important because they would eventually help investigators understand why, years after his escape, other criminals would be willing to risk a violent confrontation with law enforcement in an attempt to free him. According to the information provided, investigators also connected Nash to a mass prison escape in 1931. That detail is important because it reinforces the picture of Nash as someone whose influence extended beyond his own crimes. He was not isolated. He existed within a criminal environment in which information, contacts, transportation, weapons, and assistance could be shared. Every connection increased the possibility that an arrest would not be the end of a criminal career, but the beginning of another attempt at escape. For almost 3 years after his 1930 escape, Nash remained beyond the reach of the authorities. Then, in June 1933, the situation finally changed. On June 16th, FBI Special Agents Frank Smith and F. Joseph Lackey, working with Police Chief Otto Reed of McAlester, Oklahoma, located Nash in Hot Springs, Arkansas. After years of searching, the fugitive was finally in custody. There is a particular significance in the timing. Nash was captured only one day before the massacre that would bear the name of Kansas City. At the moment of his arrest, however, there was no way for the officers involved to know what was already being set in motion elsewhere. For Smith, Lackey, and Chief Reed, the capture represented the successful conclusion of a long pursuit. Nash was under control. The next task was to return him to the federal prison at Leavenworth. From Hot Springs, Nash was taken to Fort Smith. From there, he was placed on a Missouri Pacific train for the journey toward Kansas. He was a prisoner again. He was handcuffed, surrounded by law enforcement officers, and being moved toward the institution from which he had escaped nearly 3 years earlier. On paper, the situation appeared straightforward. The authorities had found the fugitive. They had arrested him. They were returning him to prison. But the people around Nash were not the only ones who understood what his capture meant. Word of the arrest reached the criminal world. Nash had spent years building relationships with people who had reasons to care about his freedom. Now those relationships became the foundation of a rescue effort. The critical piece of information was his travel schedule. The train carrying Nash was expected to arrive at Union Station in Kansas City at approximately 7:15 a.m. on June 17th. That time was more than a timetable. It became the key to the entire operation. Knowing where Nash would be and when he would arrive meant that anyone determined to free him could prepare an interception. The journey no longer belonged solely to the officers escorting a prisoner. It had become a race between the people trying to return Nash to prison and those preparing to take him away. The plan to rescue Nash would eventually involve Vernon C. Vern Miller, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, Adam Ricchetti, and several other criminal associates. But before their names became associated with the gunfire at Union Station, it is important to remember what Nash represented to them. He was not simply a stranger who happened to be in custody. He was part of a criminal network. His history with bank robbers and other professional criminals meant that his imprisonment affected people beyond himself. To those willing to organize a rescue, his return to Leavenworth was something worth preventing, even if doing so required confronting armed law enforcement officers. The information available about Nash does not provide a detailed account of what he thought during his final journey. There is no need to invent one. What can be established is more stark. On June 16th, he had been captured. By the following morning, he was being transported toward the prison that had held him before. He had escaped once, but now he was in handcuffs again. The officers responsible for him were carrying out their duty. They were moving a prisoner from one point to another. Yet somewhere ahead, a group of men was preparing to intercept them. The significance of Nash's schedule became clear when Vernon Miller began organizing the rescue. Miller's background made him particularly suited to the task. He had served during World War I and had received training in the use of machine guns. After returning to South Dakota, he had even served as a police officer and sheriff. But his life had moved in a very different direction. He was later convicted of embezzling public funds and became involved in criminal circles in St. Paul and Chicago. The FBI also regarded him as a hired gun connected to Louis Buckleter. When word of Nash's capture reached Kansas City, Miller became the man who began putting the rescue operation together. At Frank Malloy's bar, Miller made repeated telephone calls in search of assistance. The names of Richard Galataz, Herbert Farmer, Louis Doc Stachey, and Frank Malloy were connected to the effort. Miller needed men capable of confronting the law enforcement officers escorting Nash. Eventually, two names emerged that would become central to the operation: Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti. Their involvement meant that the rescue was no longer merely an idea. It was becoming an organized operation. Meanwhile, Nash continued toward Kansas City, unaware that his destination had become the planned meeting point for two opposing forces. The officers accompanying him were trying to complete a prisoner transfer. The men waiting for him were preparing to prevent it. The timetable was known. The location was known. The target was known. Everything depended on what happened when the two groups finally met. Nash's capture had taken years of investigation. His escape from Leavenworth had triggered a nationwide search. His eventual arrest in Hot Springs should have marked the end of that story. Instead, it became the beginning of its most violent chapter. The manhunt that had once followed Nash would soon be replaced by a manhunt for the men who tried to rescue him. And at the center of that operation stood Vernon Miller, a former lawman who had crossed into the criminal world and was now preparing to use his knowledge, his connections, and his experience with weapons to help take a prisoner away from federal custody. By the time Nash's train approached Kansas City, the plan was already moving. His years as a fugitive were approaching their final hours. He simply did not yet know that his greatest danger was no longer being captured by the law. It was being rescued by the people who wanted him free. Before the gunfire at Kansas City's Union Station, before Frank Nash became one of 5 people to die in a matter of seconds, there was a plan. It was not improvised at the station. It was not the result of a sudden argument or an unexpected confrontation. The attempt to free Nash had been organized in advance. And one of the most important figures in that organization was Vern Miller. Miller's life had already crossed several very different worlds. He had served in the military during World War I, where he received training that included the use of machine guns. After returning to South Dakota, He demonstrated enough familiarity with law enforcement to become a police officer and eventually a sheriff. For a time, Miller occupied the same side of the law as the people he would later oppose. But his career did not remain there. His path eventually turned toward crime, and the transition would take him into the criminal underworld of St. Paul and Chicago. Miller was convicted of embezzling public funds, a crime that marked a sharp contrast between the authority he had once possessed and the direction his life was taking. He subsequently became connected with organized criminal figures, and the FBI regarded him as a hired gun associated with Louis Buckleter. That reputation mattered when Frank Nash was captured in Hot Springs, Arkansas, on June 16, 1933. Nash was not simply another fugitive who had been arrested. He was a professional criminal with a long record, a history of escaping custody, and connections to other criminals. His capture, therefore, carried consequences beyond his own imprisonment. For people in his criminal circle, Nash's return to Leavenworth represented the loss of a valuable associate and perhaps a threat to the network around him. The response was an attempt to get him back. In Kansas City, Richard Galataz, Herbert Farmer, Louis Doc Stachey, and Frank Malloy became involved in organizing the rescue effort. Miller was selected to take a leading role in making the plan possible. The details supplied about this stage of the case show a deliberate effort to gather the necessary people rather than a spontaneous decision made in the final moments. Miller went to Frank Malloy's bar in Kansas City and began making repeated telephone calls in search of assistance. He needed men willing and able to take part in a dangerous operation against law enforcement. The target was known. The location was known. Most importantly, the schedule was known. Frank Nash was being transported back toward the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. His train was expected to arrive at Kansas City's Union Station at approximately 7:15 in the morning on June 17th. That timetable gave the rescue plan a precise point around which everything could be organized. Miller's task was therefore not simply to find criminals. He needed people capable of acting quickly when Nash appeared. Eventually, two names entered the operation: Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti. Floyd was approximately 29 years old and already known as a bank robber. Ricchetti was younger, approximately 23, but also had a criminal history involving robbery in banks. Their names would later become permanently associated with the Kansas City Massacre. But at this stage, they were simply two men being brought into a plan designed to free Nash. Their arrival would transform Miller's effort from a search for assistance into a concrete operation. The significance of Floyd and Ricchetti becomes clearer when considering what happened to them on the journey to Kansas City. Their vehicle broke down in Bolivar, Missouri. They stopped at a garage while the problem was being dealt with. It might have been an ordinary inconvenience, the sort of delay that could happen to anyone traveling by car. But then Sheriff Jack Killingsworth entered the garage. Ricchetti recognized him. According to the FBI account contained in the supplied information, Ricchetti immediately pointed a machine gun at the sheriff. Floyd drew 2.45 pistols and took control of the situation. The two men then obtained another vehicle. They forced Killingsworth to accompany them for a time before eventually releasing him. The incident was significant because it demonstrated the level of danger already surrounding the rescue operation before the conspirators even reached Kansas City. They were not approaching the city as ordinary travelers. They were armed, prepared to use those weapons, and already willing to confront a law enforcement officer in order to continue their journey. By approximately 10 p.m. on June 16th, Floyd and Ricchetti reached Kansas City. There, they met Vernon Miller. The critical information was already in place. Nash was expected to arrive the following morning. The location was Union Station. The approximate time was 7:15 a.m. Miller now had the men and the opportunity required to put the plan into action. The night before the massacre, therefore, represents one of the most important moments in the entire case. There was still time for the operation to end without bloodshed. Nash was still alive. The officers who would escort him were still alive. The men preparing the rescue had not yet confronted them, but the plan was already moving toward its final stage. There is no need to invent conversations between Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti to understand what was happening. The known facts are enough. A fugitive had been captured. His associates learned where and when he would be transferred. Miller sought assistance. Floyd and Ricchetti came to Kansas City. The three men met. The timetable was known. The rescue was agreed upon. Everything depended on what would happen at Union Station the next morning. Miller's background made him an especially important figure in this sequence. He had once worked within law enforcement. He knew what it meant to operate around police and understand the practical realities of armed confrontation. He had also acquired experience with weapons and connections within the criminal world. The man organizing the rescue was therefore someone who had moved from one side of the law to the other. That history adds context to the role he played, but it does not make the operation less dangerous or less deliberate. The people waiting for Nash were not simply criminals caught in an unexpected confrontation. They were preparing to intercept a prisoner during an organized transfer. The consequences would fall not only on the people involved in the rescue, but on officers whose role was to carry out that transfer. As the night of June 16th ended, the two sides were moving toward the same place from completely different directions. Nash and the officers escorting him were approaching Kansas City as part of a lawful prisoner transfer. Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti were preparing to meet them with weapons. One group expected to continue a routine journey toward Leavenworth. The other intended to prevent that journey from continuing. The difference between those two expectations would become clear only after the first shots were fired. By the morning of June 17th, Vernon Miller had completed the essential work of organizing the rescue. The people, the weapons, the vehicle, and the timetable were in place. There was nothing left to organize except the final movement. What happened next would last only about 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds would kill 4 law enforcement officers and Frank Nash, destroy the rescue plan's original purpose, and trigger a nationwide manhunt for the men who had come to Kansas City intending to set a prisoner free. The man at the center of that plan was Vernon Miller. He would not live long enough to stand trial for what happened. But before his own violent death, the plan he helped assemble would leave behind one of the most consequential crime scenes of the gangster era. The next morning, Union Station would no longer be simply a place where trains arrived. It would become the scene of a massacre. By the time Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti arrived in Kansas City on the night of June 16th, 1933, the operation to rescue Frank Nash had already moved beyond an idea. Vernon Miller had been gathering the necessary people, information, and resources. Nash had been captured in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and was being transported toward Leavenworth. His arrival time in Kansas City was known. Union Station had become the destination around which the entire plan would revolve. Floyd and Ricchetti were now part of it. Floyd was approximately 29 years old and already known as a bank robber. His name had become associated with the criminal world of the period, while Ricchetti, approximately 23, had a criminal history involving robbery and banks. They were not law enforcement officers, and they were not strangers to the dangers of the criminal world. Their involvement in the rescue would place them directly on a collision course with the officers responsible for transporting Nash. Yet before they reached Kansas City, an unexpected interruption occurred in Bolivar, Missouri. Their vehicle broke down. For a plan that depended heavily on timing, the breakdown was more than an inconvenience. The men needed to continue toward Kansas City, but their immediate transportation had failed. They stopped at a garage while the problem was being addressed. It was there that Sheriff Jack Killingsworth entered. Ricchetti recognized him. According to the FBI account contained in the supplied information, Ricchetti reacted immediately. He pointed a machine gun at the sheriff. Floyd drew 2.45 pistols and took control of the situation. The incident transformed an ordinary vehicle breakdown into another confrontation involving armed criminals and law enforcement. The sheriff was not simply confronted and left behind. Floyd and Ricchetti took another vehicle and forced Killingsworth to accompany them. At some point afterward, they released him. The episode did not stop the journey. Floyd and Ricchetti continued toward Kansas City. But it demonstrated the seriousness of the operation before the men had even reached their final destination. They were armed. They had already confronted a sheriff. And they were continuing toward a city where they expected to intercept a prisoner surrounded by law enforcement officers. Their objective remained Frank Nash. The exact sequence of every movement between Bolivar and Kansas City is not contained in the supplied information. And there is no need to fill those gaps with speculation. What can be established is that by approximately 10 p.m. on June 16th, Floyd and Ricchetti had reached Kansas City and met Vernon Miller. The three men were now together. Miller knew the timetable. Nash was expected at Union Station at approximately 7:15 the following morning. The operation could now proceed. At this point, the contrast between the two groups approaching Union Station becomes especially important. On one side was Nash, a fugitive who had already escaped from Leavenworth and spent years beyond the reach of the authorities. He had finally been captured and was being returned to prison. With him were officers whose responsibility was to complete that transfer. On the other side were men who had come to Kansas City with the specific intention of preventing Nash from returning to custody. The two groups had entirely different reasons for being there, but their paths were converging on the same place and the same moment. Floyd and Ricchetti's arrival completed a critical part of Miller's preparations. Earlier, Miller had been making telephone calls at Frank Malloy's bar, looking for assistance. Richard Galataz, Herbert Farmer, Louis Doc Stachy, and Frank Malloy had been involved in organizing the rescue effort. Now the two men selected to participate directly had arrived. Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti had the information necessary to act. They knew the location. They knew the approximate time. They knew that Nash would be accompanied by law enforcement. There was no indication that the officers escorting Nash understood the danger waiting for them. From their perspective, the mission was to move a prisoner from federal custody through Kansas City and eventually back to Leavenworth. But the criminal group had been preparing for a different outcome. The plan depended on getting close enough to Nash to take him away. That meant approaching armed officers. The possibility of violence was therefore inherent in the operation. The previous confrontation with Sheriff Killingsworth had already demonstrated that Floyd and Ricchetti were prepared to use weapons to continue their journey. As the night continued, Kansas City remained the meeting point for all of these circumstances. Nash was alive. The officers were alive. The three men waiting for him were alive. Nothing had yet happened at Union Station, but the conditions for the massacre had already been established. The information about Nash's arrival had reached the people who wanted him freed. Miller had gathered Floyd and Ricchetti. Their vehicle trouble had delayed them, but had not prevented their arrival. And now the three principal suspects were together in Kansas City, waiting for morning. It is tempting in a case like this to fill such a night with imagined conversations, motives, or private thoughts. But those details are not necessary to understand the sequence. The known facts create enough tension on their own. A prisoner was approaching. A rescue team was waiting. The officers did not know what was coming. The clock was moving toward approximately 7:15 a.m. The next stage of the story would unfold not through planning, but through action. When morning came on June 17th, Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti drove a Chevrolet sedan to Union Station. At the same time, the law enforcement officers accompanying Nash prepared to move him onward. Among those officers were FBI Special Agents Frank Smith, F., Joseph Lackey, and Raymond J. Caffrey. FBI Special Agent in charge Reed Vetterli, Police Chief Otto Reed, and Kansas City officers Frank Hermanson and William Grooms. The presence of so many officers reflected the seriousness of Nash's custody, but it could not protect them from what was about to happen. Nash was handcuffed. The Chevrolet used to transport him was positioned near the east entrance of the station. From the outside, it was a prisoner transfer. Inside, the operation planned by Miller and carried out with Floyd and Ricchetti. However, it was the moment for which they had been waiting. The positions of the officers and Nash would become crucial. Caffrey opened the vehicle. Nash was directed inside. Lackey moved into the rear, with Smith beside him. Chief Reed was toward the rear right. Caffrey moved toward the driver's position. Vitterli, Hermanson, and Grooms were near the front. The men who had come to rescue Nash were close enough to strike. But the first warning did not come from the attackers. It came from Lackey, who noticed two armed men approaching from behind another vehicle. At least one of them had a machine gun. He had almost no time to warn the others. The rescue operation was about to become a firefight. The next words would be shouted rather than calmly spoken. Up, up! Then, let him have it! And the first shots would be fired. The journey that had begun with Nash's capture in Arkansas continued through Fort Smith and moved toward Kansas City was reaching its final moment. Floyd and Ricchetti had crossed Missouri to reach this place. Miller had organized the operation around the timetable. The officers had brought Nash to the station expecting to continue toward Leavenworth. None of them could have known that the next few seconds would destroy the purpose of the entire operation. The men who had come to free Nash were about to unleash gunfire around the very prisoner they intended to save. In the confusion that followed, the difference between rescuer and target would disappear. Nash would not escape. The officers would not simply surrender. And the rescue would not end with a prisoner disappearing into a waiting car. It would end with 5 people dead. For now, however, the final moment had not yet arrived. The 3 men were in position, the officers were around Nash, and Union Station stood between them. The operation had reached the point where planning ended and violence began. What happened next would take approximately 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds would define the Kansas City massacre and send investigators across the country searching for the men who had prepared it. The morning of June 17, 1933, brought the men involved in the Frank Nash transfer to the point toward which the entire operation had been moving. For the law enforcement officers, it was the final stage of returning a fugitive to federal custody. For Vernon Miller, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, and Adam Ricchetti, it was the moment they had been preparing for. Frank Nash was alive, handcuffed, and surrounded by officers. The men who intended to rescue him were nearby, armed and waiting. The scene at Union Station was about to change in a matter of seconds. Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti had driven a Chevrolet sedan to the station. The vehicle was positioned near the east entrance, where Nash was to be transferred for the next stage of his journey. The officers accompanying Nash included FBI Special Agents Frank Smith, F. Joseph Lackey, and Raymond J. Caffrey, FBI Special Agent in Charge Reed Vitterli, Police Chief Otto Reed, and Kansas City officers Frank Hermanson and William Grooms. These men were there because of one responsibility: to keep Nash in custody and ensure that he continued toward Leavenworth. Nash himself had no freedom of movement. He was handcuffed. After years as a fugitive, his escape had ended, and his return to prison appeared imminent. Nothing about the scene suggested that the next few moments would become one of the most infamous law enforcement shootings of the gangster era. Caffrey opened the vehicle. Nash was directed inside. Lackey moved into the rear. Frank Smith sat beside him. Chief Otto Reed was positioned toward the rear right. Caffrey moved around toward the driver's position. Reed Vitterli, Frank Hermanson, and William Grooms were near the front of the vehicle. The positions mattered because the attack would unfold almost immediately. Lackey noticed 2 men approaching from behind another vehicle. They were armed. At least one of them had a machine gun. There was almost no time to respond. The officers had not been given an opportunity to prepare for a gun battle. They were dealing with a prisoner transfer, and then, suddenly, armed men were moving toward them. The warning came, "Up, up." It was followed by the command, "Let him have it." Then the gunfire began. The entire confrontation lasted approximately 30 seconds. In ordinary circumstances, 30 seconds can pass without notice. In this case, it was long enough for the rescue attempt to become a massacre. Frank Hermanson was shot and killed. William Grooms was also shot and killed. 2 Kansas City officers who had been standing near the vehicle were suddenly among the dead. Reed Vetterli was wounded in the arm. Raymond J. Caffrey was shot while preparing to take the driver's position. Inside the vehicle, the situation became equally catastrophic. Frank Nash was struck by gunfire. The prisoner whom the attackers had come to rescue was now one of the people caught in the line of fire. Chief Otto Reed was also hit. Nash died at the scene. Reed died as well. Joseph Lackey was struck 3 times, but survived. Frank Smith survived the attack. Caffrey, however, had been critically wounded. He was taken toward the hospital, but he died upon arrival. When the shooting stopped, the death toll was clear. 4 law enforcement officers had been killed: Raymond J. Caffrey of the FBI, Frank Hermanson of the Kansas City Police Department, William Grooms of the Kansas City Police Department, and Otto Reed, police chief of McAlester, Oklahoma. Frank Nash was also dead. 5 people had lost their lives in an operation that had been designed to free one of them. That was the central contradiction of the massacre. Nash was the reason the attackers were there. Yet he did not leave Union Station alive. The men who had organized the rescue had failed in its basic purpose. Instead of removing Nash from custody, they had created a crime scene in which Nash himself became a victim. The surviving officers were left to deal with the immediate consequences. Lackey had suffered 3 gunshot wounds. Vetterli had been wounded in the arm. Smith had survived. But the attack had taken the lives of colleagues and of the prisoner they were trying to transport. Caffrey's death was particularly significant because he had initially been performing the practical task of moving toward the driver's position when the attack began. The massacre had happened so quickly that there was little opportunity to prevent it once the gunfire started. The attackers did not remain at the scene. After the shooting, they ran toward their waiting vehicle. One statement heard by witnesses was, "They're all dead. Let's get out of here." A Kansas City officer fired toward the fleeing men. One of the attackers, later identified as Pretty Boy Floyd, was believed to have been struck or shot at, but the men still managed to escape. In the confusion, witnesses could not immediately agree on exactly how many gunmen had been involved. Some accounts suggested 3, while others left open the possibility of 4. That uncertainty would become part of the investigation that followed. The gunfire had stopped, but the consequences were only beginning. Within moments, Union Station had changed from a transportation point into the center of a major criminal investigation. The victims had names and responsibilities, and each had been caught in an operation they were trying to complete. Raymond J. Caffrey was an FBI agent. Frank Hermanson and William Grooms were Kansas City police officers. Otto Reed was the police chief of McAlester, Oklahoma, and had participated in Nash's capture the previous day. Frank Nash was the prisoner they had been transporting. Their deaths created a case that could not be treated as an ordinary local crime. The circumstances involved federal officers, a fugitive with a long criminal history, and a coordinated attempt by armed men to remove him from custody. The scale of the response would therefore extend far beyond the immediate crime scene. The FBI began examining the events and tracing the people connected to Nash. The investigators would eventually focus on Vernon Miller, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Adam Ricchetti. But at the moment of the shooting, those names were not yet the final answer. The men had escaped. Their identities and precise roles had to be established. Investigators would have to reconstruct the rescue plan, determine who had been present, and connect the suspects to the crime. That process would lead them through criminal associations, safe locations, physical evidence, and the movements of the fugitives after the massacre. The first major clue would eventually come from Adam Ricchetti. But before the investigation could reach that point, there was the question of where the 3 men had gone. Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti had escaped from Union Station. Their attempt to free Nash had failed, but they had succeeded in avoiding immediate capture. The law had lost 4 officers and a prisoner. The suspects were now fugitives themselves. The same machinery of pursuit that had once been used to find Frank Nash would soon be directed toward the men responsible for the attack. The irony was difficult to ignore. Nash had spent years running from the authorities. On June 16th, he had finally been caught. On June 17th, other criminals had attempted to take him back. The attempt had ended with Nash dead. And now the men who had tried to rescue him were the ones being hunted. The massacre lasted only about 30 seconds, but those seconds created consequences that would continue for years. Miller would eventually be found dead in Michigan. Floyd would be killed in Ohio. Ricchetti would be captured, prosecuted, and ultimately executed. Yet none of those later events could erase what had happened at Union Station. The central fact remained: 4 law enforcement officers had been killed while carrying out the transfer of a prisoner, and that prisoner had also died. The rescue had become a massacre. In the immediate aftermath, however, investigators did not yet know how the entire operation had been assembled. They had a crime scene, wounded survivors, dead officers, a dead prisoner, and fugitives who had vanished. Somewhere among the evidence was the beginning of an explanation. The FBI would now have to reconstruct the chain of events from the moment Nash was captured in Arkansas to the moment the gunfire erupted in Kansas City. And one of the most important pieces of that reconstruction would eventually connect Adam Ricchetti directly to Vernon Miller. The gunfire at Union Station had ended, but for investigators the real work was only beginning. On the morning of June 17, 1933, Kansas City had become the scene of a crime that could not be understood simply by looking at the bodies left behind. 4 law enforcement officers were dead. Frank Nash, the prisoner they had been transporting, was also dead. Several other officers had survived with serious injuries, and the men believed responsible had disappeared almost as quickly as they had appeared. The immediate problem was identification. Witnesses had seen armed men approaching the officers, but the confusion of the attack made it difficult to establish exactly how many gunmen had been present. Some witnesses believed there had been 3. Others could not exclude the possibility of 4. The attackers had moved quickly, and the shooting had lasted only about 30 seconds. That left investigators with a crime scene that had produced enormous consequences, but very little time in which anyone could have clearly observed what was happening. The FBI, therefore, had to reconstruct the event from the surviving evidence and from the criminal network surrounding Frank Nash. Nash's history became an important starting point. He had spent years in the criminal world, had escaped from Leavenworth, and had maintained relationships with other professional criminals. His capture in Hot Springs had been followed almost immediately by an attempt to rescue him. That meant investigators had to look beyond the scene at Union Station. They had to determine who had known about Nash's arrest, who had learned his travel schedule, and who could have organized an armed operation in Kansas City. The investigation eventually focused on 3 men: Vernon C. Vern Miller, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, and Adam Ricchetti. According to the FBI's conclusions, these 3 men were the principal gunmen involved in the attack. But identifying suspects was not enough. Investigators needed evidence connecting them to the rescue effort. One of the important pieces of evidence involved Adam Ricchetti and Vernon Miller. Investigators found Ricchetti's fingerprints on beer bottles at Miller's residence in Kansas City. The significance of that discovery was not that a fingerprint by itself explained the massacre. It was that the physical evidence placed Ricchetti in a location connected to Miller, one of the central figures in the rescue operation. Combined with the other information gathered during the investigation, it helped investigators reconstruct the relationship between the 2 men and their presence in Kansas City around the time of the attack. The evidence also had to be considered alongside the movements of the suspects. The investigators were not dealing with men who remained in place after the shooting. Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti had escaped. Their movements after the massacre became another part of the case. The fugitives were no longer simply suspects in an investigation. They were men actively attempting to avoid capture. Vernon Miller disappeared from Kansas City with his girlfriend, Vivian Mathias. Around June 19th, they reached Chicago. Miller was believed to have hidden with a member of the Barker Karpus gang before moving again. The fact that Miller could move between criminal connections made the investigation more difficult. The search was not limited to one city. Authorities had to follow a trail that crossed state lines and depended on information about people who were accustomed to operating outside the reach of law enforcement. The FBI continued the search across multiple states. Miller remained one of the central targets because of his role in organizing the rescue. The investigation eventually led agents to Chicago. On October 31st, 1933, they located Miller at the apartment of Vivian Mathias. It appeared that the long search might finally be over. But Miller escaped before the agents could take him into custody. The opportunity had been lost. Mathias, however, was arrested. She later pleaded guilty to harboring and concealing Miller. Her arrest demonstrated the continuing effort to locate the fugitive. But it did not solve the central problem. Miller was still free. He had avoided capture again, and he would never stand trial for the Kansas City massacre. His disappearance would eventually end not in a courtroom, but with his death. The circumstances surrounding Miller's death would themselves become another violent chapter in the story. On November 29, 1933, his body was found in a ditch near Detroit, Michigan. He had been severely beaten and assaulted, and he had been strangled. The man who had helped organize the rescue of Frank Nash was now dead. The FBI received information that Miller had previously been involved in a conflict with an associate of Longueuil Willman, an influential figure in the New Jersey underworld. According to the information gathered by investigators, Miller had shot the man during a dispute. A Zwillman associate was believed to have retaliated by killing Miller. Miller therefore died before the authorities could bring him before a court for the massacre. His death removed one of the principal suspects from the legal process, leaving investigators and historians without a trial in which his role could be tested through testimony and cross-examination. That absence would become important when considering the unanswered questions surrounding the case. The FBI had reached its conclusions about the principal gunman, but the deaths of Miller and Floyd meant that only one of the three principal suspects would ultimately face a courtroom. That man was Adam Ricchetti. Before his trial, however, Ricchetti remained a fugitive. He and Floyd continued to move through the country, attempting to remain beyond the reach of investigators. They eventually traveled to Ohio with two women, Beulah Juanita Baird and Rose Baird. The group rented an apartment in Buffalo, New York, and attempted to keep a low profile. They largely avoided contact with neighbors. Floyd's behavior reportedly drew attention because he frequently moved around the apartment, but the group remained there for a period of time. More than a year had passed since the massacre, yet the investigation had not ended. Miller was dead. Floyd and Ricchetti were still alive. The FBI and local authorities continued to search for them. Eventually, Floyd and Ricchetti decided to return toward Oklahoma. That decision would bring the investigation to another turning point. On October 20th, 1934, their vehicle crashed near Wellsville, Ohio. The accident disrupted their movement and forced them to abandon the vehicle. Floyd and Ricchetti left on foot, carrying weapons, and entered the surrounding woods. Their attempt to remain fugitives had suddenly become much more difficult. Sheriff J. H. Fultz discovered them, and a gunfight followed. Ricchetti was captured. Floyd escaped. For investigators, the capture of Ricchetti was a major breakthrough. One of the three men identified by the FBI as a principal gunman was finally in custody. Floyd, however, remained free. The pursuit continued for another 2 days. On October 22, 1934, FBI agents and local authorities were still searching for Floyd. A group of agents led by Melvin Purvis was operating near Clarkson, Ohio, when they encountered a vehicle near a corn crib. Floyd emerged carrying a .45 pistol. Gunfire followed. Floyd was wounded. According to the supplied FBI account, when officers approached him, he said, "I'm done for. You've hit me twice." He died approximately 15 minutes later. Floyd was about 30 years old. With Floyd dead and Miller already dead, Adam Ricchetti became the only one of the three principal suspects who could be brought before a court. The investigation had now moved from the question of where the fugitives were hiding to the question of what the surviving suspect would face in court. Ricchetti's capture did not erase the uncertainty surrounding every detail of the massacre. It did, however, give prosecutors an opportunity that had been impossible with Miller and Floyd. For the first time, one of the men identified as a principal participant would have to answer for the events of June 17, 1933. The path from Union Station to the courtroom had taken almost 2 years. During that time, the case had produced dead suspects, fugitives, physical evidence, and conflicting accounts about the precise roles of the men involved. The FBI maintained that Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti were the three principal gunmen. Yet the deaths of two of them meant that the full story of what happened during those 30 seconds could never be examined through a complete trial of all three. Now the responsibility for resolving the case would fall on the prosecution of Adam Ricchetti. On March 1, 1935, a Jackson County grand jury indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The 4 charges corresponded to the 4 law enforcement officers killed in the massacre. The prisoner Frank Nash was also dead, but the indictment focused on the deaths of the officers. The case was finally moving into the legal stage. The investigation had traced the fugitives from Kansas City to Chicago, from Chicago to hiding places elsewhere, and eventually to Ohio. Miller had been killed before capture. Floyd had been killed after his final confrontation with authorities. Ricchetti alone remained to face the consequences in court. The manhunt was over. The trial was about to begin. By the time Adam Ricchetti stood before a court, almost 2 years had passed since the gunfire at Kansas City's Union Station. The morning of June 17, 1933, had begun with a prisoner transfer and ended with 5 people dead. 4 of those victims were law enforcement officers, FBI Special Agent Raymond J. Caffrey, Kansas City officers Frank Hermanson and William Grooms, and Police Chief Otto Reed of McAllister, Oklahoma. The 5th was Frank Nash, the fugitive whom the attackers had intended to rescue. The 3 men identified by the FBI as the principal gunmen had taken very different paths after the massacre. Vernon Miller had disappeared and was later found dead in Michigan. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd had remained a fugitive until he was killed in Ohio. Adam Ricchetti was the only one who survived long enough to stand trial. His capture had come after more than a year of pursuit. On October 20th, 1934, Ricchetti and Floyd had been traveling through Ohio when their vehicle crashed near Wellsville. The accident forced them to abandon the vehicle and flee into the woods. Sheriff J. H. Fultz discovered them, and a gunfight followed. Ricchetti was captured. Floyd escaped, but his freedom lasted only 2 more days. On October 22nd, FBI agents and local authorities found Floyd near Clarkson, Ohio. He was wounded during the confrontation and died approximately 15 minutes later. With Floyd dead and Miller already gone, Ricchetti became the sole remaining principal suspect available to prosecutors. His capture transformed the Kansas City massacre from a manhunt into a courtroom case. On March 1, 1935, a Jackson County grand jury indicted Ricchetti on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The charges concerned the 4 law enforcement officers killed during the attack: Raymond J. Caffrey, Frank Hermanson, William Grooms, and Otto Reed. The indictment marked a new stage in the long aftermath of the massacre. For investigators, the task had been to identify the men connected to the attack and follow them as they attempted to escape. For prosecutors, the task was different. They now had to establish Ricchetti's responsibility in a legal proceeding. The case was no longer simply about what investigators believed had happened. It had to be presented through the formal process of a trial. The trial began on June 10, 1935. Nearly 2 years had passed since the gunfire at Union Station, but the deaths remained at the center of the case. The prosecution was dealing with an event that had shocked law enforcement because the victims had been attacked while carrying out the transfer of a prisoner. The circumstances were especially severe because the violence had been directed against officers who were attempting to maintain custody of Nash. The prosecution's case therefore existed within the larger reconstruction that had emerged during the investigation. The FBI had identified Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti as the three principal gunmen. Evidence had helped connect Ricchetti with Miller, including the discovery of Ricchetti's fingerprints on beer bottles at Miller's residence in Kansas City. Investigators had also traced Ricchetti's movements with Floyd after the massacre, eventually leading to their capture in Ohio. The physical evidence and the history of the suspect's movements formed part of the larger picture that had led authorities to identify Ricchetti as a principal participant. Yet the courtroom also represented the limits of what could be conclusively established. Miller was dead. Floyd was dead. Neither could appear before the jury to explain his role or challenge the prosecution's account. The trial therefore focused on the one surviving defendant. Ricchetti had to face the consequences of the case alone. The significance of that fact should not be overlooked. A full trial involving all three principal suspects was impossible. The prosecution could not place Miller and Floyd in the witness box. Whatever they might have said about the planning or the shooting would remain unavailable. Ricchetti was therefore the only person identified as a principal gunman who could receive a judicial verdict. The trial continued through June. On June 17, 1935, exactly 2 years after the massacre at Union Station, the jury reached its decision. Ricchetti was found guilty, and the jury recommended the death penalty. The date itself gave the verdict a grim symmetry. 2 years earlier, four officers and Frank Nash had died during the attempted rescue. 2 years later, the remaining principal suspect had been condemned to die for his role in the deaths of the officers. But the legal process did not end with the verdict. Ricchetti appealed his conviction. The case moved through the courts, and the question of whether the death sentence should stand remained unresolved for several years. On May 3, 1938, the Missouri Supreme Court upheld the conviction. The ruling left Ricchetti facing execution. Yet another legal issue emerged. His lawyers argued that he was mentally incompetent. That claim required a separate determination. A hearing was conducted to consider whether Ricchetti was capable of being held legally responsible for his actions. The conclusion was that he was competent. The legal process had therefore reached its final stage. Ricchetti had been convicted, his appeal had failed, and the competency issue had not prevented the sentence from being carried out. The man who had escaped from the scene of the massacre in 1933 was now a condemned prisoner himself. On October 7, 1938, Ricchetti was executed in the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. His death ended the legal story of the three men identified by the FBI as the principal gunmen. Miller had died violently before trial. Floyd had been killed while fleeing authorities. Ricchetti alone had passed through the complete sequence of capture, indictment, trial, appeal, competency proceedings, and execution. But even with the execution, not every question surrounding the massacre disappeared. One of the most important concerns the exact role of each man during the shooting. The FBI's conclusion was that Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti were the principal gunmen. Yet determining who fired particular shots was more difficult. The surviving information does not establish every individual action during those approximately 30 seconds. In particular, questions remained about who fired the shots that killed Nash. That distinction matters because a historical account should separate an official investigative conclusion from details that cannot be established with the same certainty. The FBI identified the three men as the principal gunmen. That is the established conclusion presented in the case materials. But the exact responsibility for individual shots is a more complicated question. Floyd and his family denied that he participated in the Kansas City massacre. Other accounts from the criminal world also presented differing versions. These claims do not erase the FBI's conclusion. but they demonstrate why the case has continued to contain disputed elements. A careful account must acknowledge the difference between what investigators concluded and what remained contested. The trial of Ricchetti therefore resolved an important legal question without resolving every historical question. The jury found him guilty of the 4 murders charged against him. The Missouri Supreme Court upheld that conviction. A competency hearing determined that he was legally responsible, and in 1938, he was executed. But there was never a comparable trial for Miller or Floyd. Their deaths prevented a courtroom examination of their individual roles. The Kansas City Massacre had begun as an attempt to free Frank Nash, but its aftermath became a long legal and investigative process that lasted years. Nash himself never reached Leavenworth. The officers who were escorting him never completed their assignment. Miller never faced a jury. Floyd never faced a jury. Ricchetti did. His conviction provided the judicial conclusion to the case, but it could not restore the lives lost at Union Station. The 4 officers remained the central human cost of the violence: Caffrey, Hermanson, Grooms, and Reed. Their deaths had occurred in approximately 30 seconds, while the legal consequences took years to unfold. The story had begun with a fugitive trying to remain free and criminals trying to return him to freedom. It ended with one of those criminals sentenced to death, and the others dead before trial. Yet the larger significance of the massacre extended beyond the fate of the 3 suspects. The attack had demonstrated how dangerous organized criminal groups had become and how vulnerable law enforcement officers could be even during what appeared to be a controlled prisoner transfer. The consequences would continue long after Ricchetti's execution. The Kansas City Massacre would become an important event in the history of the FBI and in the federal response to violent crime. The final chapter of the story, therefore, is not only about the men who planned and carried out the attack. It is about the people who died, the institution that responded, and the legacy left by 30 seconds of violence at a railway station in Kansas City. The execution of Adam Ricchetti in 1938 brought the legal consequences of the Kansas City Massacre to an end. But it did not eliminate every question surrounding what happened at Union Station on June 17, 1933. By then, Vernon Miller was dead, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was dead, and Ricchetti himself had been executed. None of the 3 men identified by the FBI as the principal gunmen remained alive to provide a complete account of the operation. That fact is essential to understanding why the massacre has continued to contain disputed details. The broad outline of the case is clear. Frank Nash had been captured in Hot Springs, Arkansas, on June 16, 1933, and was being returned to Leavenworth. His associates learned the schedule. Vernon Miller organized an effort to rescue him and brought Floyd and Ricchetti into the operation. On the morning of June 17th, the 3 men were waiting near Union Station. When Nash was being transferred to the vehicle, armed men approached. Gunfire erupted and lasted approximately 30 seconds. 4 law enforcement officers and Nash were killed. The attackers escaped. The FBI subsequently identified Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti as the principal gunmen. Yet knowing the broad sequence is not the same as knowing every detail. One of the most persistent questions concerns the precise role of each man during the shooting, particularly the question of who fired the shots that killed Nash. The FBI's official conclusion was that Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti were the principal gunmen involved in the attack. That conclusion became the foundation for the subsequent investigation and prosecution. But the exact actions of each participant during those few seconds were harder to establish. The violence happened with extraordinary speed. Witnesses were confronted with armed men, shouted commands, and rapid gunfire. Some witnesses could not even agree immediately on whether 3 or 4 gunmen had taken part. That uncertainty illustrates the difficulty of reconstructing a chaotic shooting from eyewitness memories alone. Floyd's involvement became especially controversial. The FBI identified him as one of the principal gunmen, and he was pursued as a suspect after the massacre. His eventual death in Ohio in October 1934 prevented him from ever appearing before a jury. Floyd and his family denied that he had participated in the Kansas City massacre. Other accounts from the criminal world also offered differing versions of what happened. These denials and alternative accounts have remained part of the historical record, but they must be distinguished from the official FBI conclusion. The evidence supplied for this case does not permit a definitive reconstruction of every shot fired. It does, however, establish that the FBI regarded Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti as the three principal gunmen, and that the investigation connected the three men to the rescue operation. This distinction is important in any serious account of the case. True crime storytelling can easily turn uncertainty into certainty, especially when a dramatic event contains unanswered questions. But the historical record is more complicated. The massacre can be described accurately without pretending that every disputed detail has been resolved. What is certain is the scale of the human cost. Raymond J. Caffrey, Frank Hermanson, William Grooms, and Otto Reed were killed while carrying out their responsibilities. They were not pursuing the attackers at the time of their deaths. They were involved in transporting a prisoner. Their deaths demonstrated how quickly an ordinary law enforcement operation could become a deadly confrontation when organized criminals decided that freeing a prisoner was worth the risk of armed violence. Caffrey was an FBI special agent. Hermanson and Grooms were Kansas City police officers. Reed was the police chief of McAlester, Oklahoma, and had participated in Nash's capture the day before. Each had a role in a chain of events that brought Nash back into custody, and each became a victim of the rescue attempt. The circumstances surrounding Frank Nash's death are perhaps the most tragic contradiction in the case. The attackers had come because they wanted Nash alive and free, yet their gunfire killed him. The prisoner at the center of the rescue was therefore one of the people who died as a direct consequence of the attempt to save him. The purpose of the operation and its outcome were completely opposed. Instead of removing Nash from the custody of the officers, the attack ensured that he would never return to Leavenworth. The massacre also demonstrated the reach of the criminal networks of the era. Nash's capture in Arkansas had been followed by a rescue effort in Kansas City involving men with connections across several parts of the criminal underworld. Miller had links to St. Paul and Chicago and was regarded by the FBI as a hired gun associated with Louis Buckleter. After the massacre, he was able to move through criminal contacts and eventually reach Chicago. Floyd and Ricchetti also managed to remain fugitives for more than a year. Their ability to travel, hide, and rely on associates demonstrated the difficulty law enforcement faced when confronting mobile criminal organizations during the Depression era. The investigation itself became a demonstration of expanding federal capabilities. The FBI followed leads across state lines, examined connections between suspects, and used physical evidence to connect individuals to one another. The discovery of Adam Ricchetti's fingerprints on beer bottles at Vernon Miller's residence in Kansas City became an important piece of evidence linking the two men. Miller's later movements were also traced. On October 31, 1933, FBI agents located him at Vivian Mathias's apartment in Chicago, but he escaped before he could be captured. Mathias was arrested and later pleaded guilty to harboring and concealing Miller. Less than a month later, Miller's life ended violently. On November 29th, his body was discovered in a ditch near Detroit. He had been severely beaten and strangled. Information received by the FBI connected his death to a dispute involving an associate of Longueuil, Zwillman. Miller had reportedly shot the man during a conflict, and a Zwillman associate was believed to have retaliated by killing Miller. His death meant that one of the central figures in the rescue operation would never answer questions. In court, Floyd's fate was different but equally final. After more than a year as a fugitive, he was killed near Clarkson, Ohio, on October 22, 1934. Ricchetti was captured 2 days earlier and eventually became the only principal suspect to face a trial. His conviction and execution provided the formal legal conclusion, but even that process could not reconstruct every detail of the shooting. The Kansas City Massacre therefore exists at the intersection of established fact and unresolved history. The official conclusion identifies the three principal gunmen. The surviving evidence establishes the rescue plan and the involvement of the three men. The deaths of Miller and Floyd, however, eliminated the possibility of hearing their testimony under oath. Ricchetti was convicted, but his trial could not recreate every moment of the 30-second gun battle. This uncertainty should not obscure the central reality of the event. Four officers died because a criminal group decided to use armed force to free a prisoner. Nash also died because of that decision. Whatever questions remain about individual shots, the consequence of the operation is beyond dispute. The massacre also became a turning point in the relationship between federal law enforcement and organized crime. The violence demonstrated the need for stronger federal tools against criminals who crossed state lines and used extreme violence. The attack occurred during an era when bank robbers and organized criminal groups could move rapidly across jurisdictions, making local enforcement alone increasingly difficult. The deaths of 4 law enforcement officers during a planned rescue exposed the danger in particularly dramatic form. In the aftermath, the FBI's authority and capabilities expanded. The event contributed to broader changes in the federal response to violent crime, including developments concerning the ability of FBI agents to carry firearms. The massacre thus became more than a single criminal episode. It became part of the historical argument for a stronger federal law enforcement system. Yet institutional changes should not overshadow the people who died. The history of the Kansas City Massacre is sometimes remembered through the names of famous gangsters. But the victims were not symbols. They were officers performing an assignment that began with the successful capture of a fugitive. Frank Nash was also a human being whose criminal history does not change the fact that he died during an operation intended to rescue him. The final irony is that nearly every person at the center of the story was ultimately destroyed by the chain of events surrounding Nash. Nash died before returning to prison. Miller died violently before trial. Floyd died while fleeing law enforcement. Ricchetti was executed after conviction. And 4 officers lost their lives during a prisoner transfer that should never have become a battlefield. The massacre lasted approximately 30 seconds. Its consequences lasted for years. Its unanswered questions remain because the people who could have explained them most completely never had the opportunity to do so. What remains is a record assembled from investigations, physical evidence, prosecutions, and the conclusions of law enforcement. That record is sufficient to establish the central story. But it also reminds us that history does not always provide a perfectly complete answer. Sometimes the most responsible account is the one that clearly separates what is known from what remains disputed. In the case of the Kansas City Massacre, that distinction matters. The official story identifies Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti as the principal gunmen. The legal record establishes Ricchetti's conviction and execution. The deaths of the 4 officers and Nash are certain. The precise responsibility for every individual shot is not. And that gap between certainty and uncertainty is one of the reasons the Kansas City Massacre remains such a significant and disturbing chapter in the history of American crime. The Kansas City Massacre did not end when the gunfire stopped at Union Station, and it did not truly end when Adam Ricchetti was executed in 1938. The immediate violence lasted approximately 30 seconds, but the consequences spread outward for years. 4 law enforcement officers had been killed while carrying out the transfer of a prisoner. Frank Nash, the man the attackers intended to rescue, had also been killed. Vernon Miller and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd were dead before either could face a courtroom, while Adam Ricchetti had been convicted and executed. Yet beyond the individual fates of the people involved, The massacre exposed a much larger problem facing American law enforcement during the era. Professional criminals were becoming increasingly mobile, heavily armed, and capable of organizing across state lines. The events at Union Station showed how quickly a prisoner transfer could become a deadly confrontation when criminal networks had enough information and enough firepower to challenge law enforcement directly. The officers escorting Nash were not expecting to walk into a battlefield. They were carrying out a prisoner transfer. Nash had been captured the previous day in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and the objective was straightforward: return him to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. The fact that 4 officers were killed during that process demonstrated the extraordinary danger created by the criminal effort to free him. Raymond J. Caffrey, Frank Hermanson, William Grooms, and Otto Reed became the human cost of that operation. Each had been connected to law enforcement, and each was carrying out responsibilities that had brought them into contact with Nash. Their deaths also revealed a vulnerability that authorities could no longer ignore. The criminals involved were not operating within the boundaries of a single city. Nash's history had already demonstrated the importance of interstate criminal networks. He had escaped from Leavenworth in 1930, remained a fugitive for years, and had connections with other bank robbers and professional criminals. The investigation into him had extended beyond the United States and into Canada. By 1933, the criminal world surrounding men like Nash was not confined to one jurisdiction. Criminals could move from state to state, obtain assistance from associates, change vehicles, find temporary places to hide, and use established relationships to evade arrest. The Kansas City Massacre showed the consequences of that mobility in the most violent possible way. The investigation that followed, therefore, had to operate on a broader scale. The FBI pursued leads involving Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti across multiple states. Miller fled Kansas City with Vivian Mathias and reached Chicago around June 19, 1933. He was believed to have hidden with a member of the Barker Karpus gang before moving again. On October 31st, FBI agents located him at Mathias's apartment. But Miller escaped before they could capture him. Mathias was arrested and later pleaded guilty to harboring and concealing him. Less than a month later, Miller was dead. His body was found on November 29th in a ditch outside Detroit, Michigan. He had been severely beaten and strangled. The FBI received information connecting his death to an earlier conflict involving an associate of Longuise Willman. Miller had reportedly shot the man during a dispute, and his Willman associate was believed to have retaliated. Miller therefore escaped the courtroom, but he did not escape the violence of the criminal world in which he had spent years operating. His death was another reminder that the people involved in organized crime faced danger not only from law enforcement, but also from one another. Floyd's disappearance lasted considerably longer. After the massacre, he and Ricchetti continued to evade authorities. They eventually traveled to Ohio with Beulah Juanita Baird and Rose Baird. The 2 men and the women rented an apartment in Buffalo, New York, and attempted to maintain a low profile. They avoided communication with neighbors, and the effort to remain unnoticed continued for more than a year. But the fugitive life eventually became increasingly difficult to sustain. In October 1934, Floyd and Ricchetti were traveling toward Oklahoma when their vehicle crashed near Wellsville, Ohio. The accident forced them to abandon the vehicle and flee into the woods. Sheriff J. H. Fultz discovered them, and a gunfight followed. Ricchetti was captured, but Floyd escaped. For Ricchetti, the capture marked the beginning of the final stage of his involvement in the case. For Floyd, it meant only another brief extension of his time as a fugitive. 2 days later, on October 22nd, FBI agents and local authorities continued searching for him near Clarkson, Ohio. A group led by Melvin Purvis encountered Floyd near a corn storage building. Floyd emerged carrying a .45 pistol. Gunfire followed. He was wounded and, according to the FBI account provided for this case, told the officers, "I'm done for. You've hit me twice. He died approximately 15 minutes later. He was about 30 years old. Floyd's death removed another central figure from the investigation. Once again, the authorities had lost the opportunity to place one of the principal suspects before a jury. Only Ricchetti remained. His subsequent prosecution became the legal culmination of the investigation. On March 1, 1935, a Jackson County grand jury indicted Ricchetti on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The charges focused on the deaths of the 4 law enforcement officers. His trial began on June 10, 1935, and on June 17, exactly 2 years after the massacre. The jury found him guilty and recommended the death penalty. Ricchetti appealed, but the Missouri Supreme Court upheld the conviction on May 3, 1938. His lawyers later argued that he was mentally incompetent, but a hearing determined that he was capable of being held legally responsible. On October 7, 1938, he was executed in the gas chamber at Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. With his death, the formal legal proceedings surrounding the principal suspects came to an end. But the institutional consequences of the massacre were broader than the prosecution of one man. The attack had demonstrated that federal law enforcement officers could be confronted by criminals who were organized, heavily armed, and prepared to use violence in public places. It also demonstrated the difficulty of dealing with criminals whose activities cross state boundaries. Miller had connections in different cities. Floyd and Ricchetti were able to move between states. The people who helped them hide could also be located far from the original crime scene. The investigation, therefore, required federal resources and cooperation across jurisdictions. The Kansas City Massacre became one of the events that helped push the FBI toward a stronger role in combating violent interstate crime. The period was already one in which notorious bank robbers and organized criminal groups had made national headlines. The massacre provided an especially stark example of what could happen when federal officers and criminal networks collided. The death of Special Agent Raymond J. Caffrey was particularly significant because it demonstrated that FBI personnel were not insulated from the violence faced by local police. Caffrey had been part of the team transporting Nash, and his death became part of the larger history of the Bureau's struggle against armed criminals. In the aftermath of events like Kansas City, federal law enforcement developed greater capacity to respond to violent fugitives. The massacre contributed to changes in the FBI's authority and capabilities, including developments involving the ability of FBI agents to carry firearms. It also became part of the broader movement towards stronger federal laws and enforcement mechanisms for dealing with criminals whose activities cross state lines. These changes were not created by one event alone, but the Kansas City Massacre became an important example of why such changes were considered necessary. There was also a psychological consequence for law enforcement. The lesson was unmistakable. A prisoner who appeared securely surrounded could still become the center of a coordinated armed assault. A transfer that appeared routine could turn deadly in seconds. The officers at Union Station had been dealing with a fugitive who had already demonstrated an ability to escape custody. They were not unaware of Nash's criminal history, but even that awareness could not prevent the sudden attack. The massacre, therefore, became a warning about the changing nature of organized crime. The criminals confronting law enforcement were no longer merely individuals committing isolated offenses. They could form temporary alliances, share information, arrange transportation, obtain weapons, and coordinate an operation around a precise timetable. The rescue attempt had been built around the knowledge that Nash would arrive at Union Station at approximately 7:15 a.m. That information transformed a prisoner transfer into a planned interception. The aftermath also left a lasting contradiction at the heart of the case. The criminals had been willing to risk everything to free Nash. Yet Nash himself died in the attempt. Miller died violently before trial. Floyd died while fleeing authorities. Ricchetti was eventually executed. The 4 officers died during the original attack. In the end, Almost every principal figure was destroyed by the chain of events that began with Nash's capture. What began as an effort to restore one man's freedom produced no freedom at all. It produced 5 deaths, years of investigation, 3 fugitive hunts, 1 murder trial, and a lasting change in the way American law enforcement confronted violent organized crime. The Union Station attack, therefore, became more than an infamous shootout. It became a warning written in the deaths of 4 officers and 1 prisoner. The criminal networks of the Depression era had demonstrated what they were willing to risk. Law enforcement responded by expanding its ability to pursue them. And for the families, colleagues, and communities left behind, no change in federal policy could undo the original loss. The names of Caffrey, Hermanson, Grooms, and Reed remained attached to the event because they were the officers who died doing their jobs. Their deaths were the reason the massacre mattered far beyond the criminal careers of the men who attacked them. The final legacy of Kansas City was therefore not simply the story of gangsters who escaped, nor the story of an FBI manhunt. It was the realization that the fight against organized crime had entered a new and more dangerous stage. And at the center of that realization stood the quiet fact that the entire catastrophe had begun, with 1 captured fugitive and a timetable for a train. Remembering the Kansas City Massacre began with a captured fugitive and ended with a legacy that reached far beyond the men who planned the rescue. On June 16, 1933, Frank Nash was finally in custody after years of evading authorities. By the morning of June 17th, he was dead, for law enforcement officers were dead with him. Vernon Miller and Charles "Pretty Boy" Floyd would later die while still fugitives. And Adam Ricchetti would be captured, convicted, and executed. The rescue that had been organized to restore Nash's freedom achieved the opposite. It destroyed the lives of nearly everyone at the center of the operation and became one of the most consequential violent encounters between organized criminals and American law enforcement during the gangster era. The most important fact to remember is that the massacre was not a random eruption of violence. It was the result of a deliberate effort to intercept a prisoner. Nash's criminal history had made him important to people in the underworld. He had escaped from Leavenworth in 1930 and remained a fugitive for years. Investigators had pursued him across a wide area, and his connections with other professional criminals continued to matter even while he was absent from federal custody. When Frank Smith, Joseph Lackey, and Police Chief Otto Reed finally captured him in Hot Springs, Arkansas, on June 16, 1933, the authorities believed they had accomplished the difficult task of bringing a dangerous fugitive back under control. Nash was taken to Fort Smith and placed on a Missouri Pacific train bound for Leavenworth. The expected arrival in Kansas City was approximately 7:15 a.m. the following morning. That schedule became the foundation of the rescue attempt. Vernon Miller learned the information and began organizing the effort. Miller's background makes his role especially striking. He had once served in the military, had received machine gun training, and had even worked as a police officer and sheriff. Yet his life had moved away from law enforcement and into organized crime. By 1933, the FBI regarded him as a hired gun connected with Louis Buckleter. Miller's experience, criminal contacts, and familiarity with firearms made him a central figure in the rescue plan. At Frank Malloy's bar, he made repeated telephone calls seeking assistance. Eventually, Charles "Pretty Boy" Floyd and Adam Ricchetti became involved. The men came to Kansas City, despite encountering trouble on the way. In Bolivar, Missouri, their vehicle broke down. When Sheriff Jack Killingsworth entered the garage, Ricchetti recognized him and pointed a machine gun at him. Floyd drew 2.45 pistols. They took another vehicle and forced the sheriff to accompany them before eventually releasing him. By approximately 10 p.m. on June 16th, Floyd and Ricchetti had reached Kansas City and met Miller. The rescue operation was now fully assembled. The next morning, Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti drove a Chevrolet sedan to Union Station. At the same time, Nash arrived under the control of law enforcement. The officers surrounding him included FBI Special Agents Frank Smith, F. Joseph Lackey, and Raymond J. Caffrey, FBI Special Agent in Charge Reed Vetterli, Police Chief Otto Reed, and Kansas City officers Frank Hermanson and William Grooms. Nash was handcuffed. The officers were carrying out the final stage of his transfer. What happened next lasted approximately 30 seconds. Lackey saw armed men approaching from behind another vehicle. At least one carried a machine gun. There was almost no time to react. A shout of "Up, up!" was followed by the command, "Let him have it!" Then the gunfire began. Hermanson and Grooms were killed. Vetterli was wounded in the arm. Caffrey was shot as he moved toward the driver's position. Inside the vehicle, Nash and Chief Reed were struck. Both died. Lackey was hit 3 times but survived, and Smith survived the attack. Caffrey was taken toward a hospital but died upon arrival. When the gunfire ended, for law enforcement officers and Frank Nash were dead. The men who had come to rescue Nash fled. One statement heard by witnesses was, "They're all dead. Let's get out of here." A Kansas City officer fired toward the fleeing attackers. One of the men, later identified as Floyd, was believed to have been struck or shot at, but the group escaped. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most important elements of the story. The FBI began tracing the criminal network around Nash and examining the movements of the suspects. Vernon Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti were identified as the principal gunmen. Physical evidence also helped connect them. Ricchetti's fingerprints were found on beer bottles at Miller's residence in Kansas City, providing an important link between the two men. But the investigation faced a major difficulty. The suspects disappeared. Miller fled with Vivian Mathias and reached Chicago around June 19th. He was believed to have hidden with a member of the Barker Karpus gang before moving again. On October 31st, FBI agents found him at Mathias's apartment, but Miller escaped. Mathias was arrested and later pleaded guilty to harboring and concealing him. Less than a month later, Miller was dead. His body was found in a ditch near Detroit on November 29, 1933. He had been severely beaten and strangled. Information received by the FBI linked his death to a dispute involving an associate of Longueuil, Zwillman. Miller had reportedly shot the man during a conflict, and a Zwillman associate was believed to have retaliated. Miller therefore died without ever facing trial. Floyd remained a fugitive for more than a year. He and Ricchetti eventually went to Ohio with Beulah, Juanita, Baird, and Rose Baird. The group rented an apartment in Buffalo, New York, and tried to remain unnoticed. Eventually, Floyd and Ricchetti traveled toward Oklahoma. Their vehicle crashed near Wellsville, Ohio, on October 20th, 1934. They abandoned it and fled into the woods. Sheriff J. H. Fultz found them, and a gunfight followed. Ricchetti was captured. Floyd escaped, but only temporarily. 2 days later, FBI agents and local authorities located him near Clarkson, Ohio. He emerged carrying a .45 pistol and was wounded during the confrontation. According to the FBI account, he told the officers, "I'm done for. You've hit me twice." He died approximately 15 minutes later. Ricchetti was now the only principal suspect left to face the legal system. On March 1st, 1935, a Jackson County grand jury indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began on June 10th. On June 17th, exactly 2 years after the massacre, the jury found him guilty and recommended the death penalty. Ricchetti appealed, but the Missouri Supreme Court upheld his conviction on May 3rd, 1938. His lawyers later argued that he was mentally incompetent, but a hearing determined that he was capable of being held legally responsible. On October 7th, 1938, Ricchetti was executed in the gas chamber at Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. With his death, the legal history of the principal suspects ended. Yet one important distinction must remain. The FBI officially identified Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti as the principal gunmen. But the exact role of each man in the shooting has remained disputed in some accounts. Floyd and his family denied his participation, and other versions from the criminal world differed. Most importantly, the surviving record does not allow every individual shot to be assigned with absolute certainty. That is particularly relevant to the question of who fired the shots that killed Nash. A responsible account must therefore separate the FBI's official conclusion from details that remain contested. The established historical record is already powerful without inventing certainty where none exists. What cannot be disputed is the human cost. Raymond Caffrey, Frank Hermanson, William Grooms, and Otto Reed were killed while performing law enforcement duties. Their deaths were not incidental to the story. They were the central tragedy of it. They had taken responsibility for transporting a prisoner and were confronted by an armed rescue operation. Nash, despite his criminal history, also became a victim of the violence intended to free him. His death remains the great irony of the case. The criminals risked everything to rescue him, yet their gunfire ensured that he would never reach Leavenworth. The massacre also changed the broader landscape of American law enforcement. It demonstrated the dangers posed by criminal organizations that could move between states, share information, obtain weapons, and organize around a precise timetable. The FBI's response became part of the expansion of federal capabilities against violent interstate crime. The Kansas City massacre contributed to changes in federal law enforcement authority and capabilities, including developments concerning FBI agents' ability to carry firearms. It became an example of why a stronger federal response to organized and violent crime was considered necessary. But institutional changes should never become the only way the story is remembered. At the heart of the case were people whose lives ended in a few seconds. The names of Caffrey, Hermanson, Grooms, and Reed deserve to remain connected to the event not merely because they were casualties, but because they were officers carrying out their duties. The massacre is sometimes remembered through the names of Miller, Floyd, and Ricchetti. Yet the reason the event became historically important was the loss suffered by those who were trying to enforce the law. Their deaths transformed a criminal rescue attempt into a national symbol of the violence of the era. The Kansas City massacre ultimately tells a story about consequences. Nash escaped prison once, but did not escape his final return to custody. Miller organized the rescue, but died before facing justice. Floyd remained a fugitive, but was killed by authorities. Ricchetti survived long enough to stand trial, but was ultimately executed. And the 4 officers who had no part in planning the violence lost their lives simply because they were carrying out a prisoner transfer when the attackers arrived. The entire chain began with one arrest and one piece of information, where Nash would be and when. From that point, the consequences moved rapidly. A rescue became a gun battle. A gun battle became a massacre. A massacre became a nationwide manhunt. The manhunt became a series of deaths and a trial. And the trial became part of a broader transformation in federal law enforcement. Nearly everything about the case demonstrates how a single decision can create consequences far beyond what those who make it originally intend. The men who planned the rescue wanted one result: Frank Nash free. They achieved the exact opposite. Nash died. 4 officers died. The conspirators themselves were eventually destroyed. And the federal government emerged from the tragedy with a clearer understanding of the threat posed by organized violent crime. The final lesson of the Kansas City massacre is therefore not about the glamour of the gangster era, nor about the reputation of the men whose names became famous. It is about the cost of violence and the irreversible nature of a decision once weapons are drawn. 30 seconds at Union Station were enough to change the lives of families, law enforcement agencies, and the people involved forever. The questions surrounding individual shots may never be completely answered. But the central truth does not require speculation, for officers died doing their jobs. Frank Nash died in the rescue intended to save him, and the criminal operation that brought them together ended in tragedy for everyone involved. That is the enduring story of the Kansas City Massacre, a story not of victory, but of consequence, loss, and the lasting price of violence.